All right, we are in the book of Mark, and as you know, Mark is a gospel. There are 4 gospels. Each of the gospels has basically the same purpose, and that is to tell the story of Jesus. And hopefully by the time you get to the end of the gospel, you will realize and understand who Jesus is, the Son of God, the King, the promised Messiah. And that is what Mark is doing when he writes this book. He's trying to tell the story of Jesus with the intent that when it's all said and done, we understand who Jesus is. And that we will fall down and worship Him and Him alone. That's right. All right? It's not about just knowing Him or just kind of having warm feelings about Him. It's about putting ourselves under His kingship. All right. So far in our book, in the study of Mark, we've watched Jesus being introduced to the Jewish people as a powerful miracle worker and teacher. We've observed how people have responded to Him, how He's performed miracles and cast out demons. And His popularity has grown immensely. In a very short period of time, it's gotten to the point where He can hardly go anywhere without a crowd following Him. But not only does Jesus do these miracles, not only is He putting on a show in a sense, but He's communicating a message. He's communicating a message about who He is. And He's demonstrated His authority over the physical world, His authority over the spiritual world, and ultimately His authority over our eternal destiny. Okay? You don't want to miss the message here. Who would ever think to claim those things about himself? What person would try to tell you and I that he is that person? Well, Jesus did. Okay? So remember, what's Mark doing? Mark is writing in such a way that when you get to the end of the story, you know and you believe that in fact Jesus is the Messiah, the coming King. Now, as with any good story, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, God is the ultimate storyteller, right? The Bible is a story. It's got characters, it's got a plot, it's got a beginning, it's got ending, it's got character development. The whole Bible is one big story. Because God is a storyteller, and He's telling His story. He's revealing Himself to us through that story. But as with any story, you have protagonists and you have antagonists. You have good guys and you have bad guys. So in the first chapter of the book of Mark, things are just going along splendidly. Jesus is growing a crowd, a following. But then we are introduced to the antagonists. We begin to experience or see the bad guys. Maybe you remember when a couple of weeks ago, Pastor John was talking about the paralytic guy who was let down through the roof by his friends. And eventually, he took up his pallet and walked away. But before Jesus healed him, Jesus said, "Your sins are forgiven." He forgave his sins. But sitting around in the crowd, Mark explains there was a little group of scribes. Now, they didn't say anything, but it's very interesting how Mark describes this. He says that they reasoned within their hearts. It's like he was reading their minds. Why does this man speak this way? Now, why does Jesus think he can forgive this man's sins? He says, that's a blasphemy. Now, notice it didn't say it out loud. Didn't say it out to the crowd, weren't trying to get things stirred up here. They were just mulling it over in their heads and probably mumbling under their breath. But Jesus knew that they were thinking this. Jesus, in His Spirit, knew what they were reasoning. So in this situation, the opposition is beginning to grow. It's just kind of starting here with these scribes. But as the meeting ended and these guys were done, they went down to the little synagogue and they grabbed some guys and they said, let me tell you what happened just down here at Bob's house tonight when they were doing a healing. Let me just, do you hear what he said? And they go, oh no, I can't do that, Just kind of started a rumbling. Then you remember Pastor Israel was talking about Levi and the tax collector, how Jesus called him to himself to follow him, and also reminded us that that same Levi became Matthew, the gospel writer, okay? Jesus invites him to follow him, and Levi says, yes, of course, and he's very excited. He says, let's go down to my house and we'll celebrate. We'll have a big party. Well, the scribes and the Pharisees kind of followed, and they got down, and they realized, they looked around and said, there were all these people eating at table. They realized, ooh, there's some questionable people here. There are other tax gatherers and sinners. And so they asked Jesus why. They didn't ask Jesus. Now, this is interesting. They didn't ask Jesus. They asked his disciples. Probably got one of the guys at the end of the table and said, hey, what's with the tax gatherers in this? These are bad guys. Why is he associating with these people? And Jesus, again, he heard it. He had a response. And hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So they run back down to the Starbucks, they all get a coffee. And this doesn't look good, okay? He's not showing respect here. Does he know who we are? They're feeling a little dissed. Then after that, John's disciples and the Pharisees came up to him and they asked, why aren't your guys fasting like the rest of us? You see, fasting was something you did. It was a means of sort of focusing all your senses and your mind and everything on God so you would, in a sense, kind of draw near to him. And Jesus says, well, that's really not necessary right at this time. You know why? Because, well, I'm here, okay? Do you think they got the message? Do you think they understood that he was proclaiming himself to be God in their midst? I don't think they really made the connection. And then finally, when the disciples were picking grains from the fields, that kind of put everything over the top. And the Pharisees came directly to Jesus and they said, look, what's going on here? Why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? They kind of got in his face. The gloves are off and the fight's on. You see, in each situation, Jesus knew what they were thinking and he had a response. He answered their questions, but they wouldn't hear him, or they couldn't hear him. See, because the problem was they were feeling threatened. They could see the people, the multitudes, were beginning to respond to Jesus. He was healing, he was casting out demons, he was teaching them new things. As a matter of fact, he was saying things that the Pharisees would never say. See, the multitudes were enamored with Jesus at this point. I wouldn't say they really were ready to follow him, but they were certainly interested in what he was doing and what he had to say. And the Pharisees didn't like this. Now, why? Well, now we're getting to today's chapter. Chapter 3, verse 1. He entered into a synagogue, and there was a man there whose hand was withered. Now, the synagogue was a public place of worship for the Jews, all right? It was where they could go and do their, kind of like their church service. And it was not the temple, all right? There was no altar, and there were no animal sacrifices going on there. There was no Holy of Holies, but there was a copy of the Torah. There was the law. And so they would pull it out, and they would read from it, and somebody would give a teaching from the Torah. Well, Jesus himself would go into the synagogues and he would teach. You see it in the Gospels. He would very regularly go into the synagogues, just like the Apostle Paul did as well. Now, do you remember what it said, the people said when Jesus went into the synagogues and taught? They said, he seems to teach with what? Authority. Does that mean he just yelled louder than everybody else, or what? Or he just pounded his fist a lot? Or this is really interesting. You see, when they used to go into the synagogues and they would teach, what would happen would be a guy would read a verse and he would get up and he would say, now, according to Rabbi Rabinowitz, this is how we interpret this verse. And then another guy would get up. Maybe he would read a verse and say, now, I disagree with Pastor Rabbi Rabinowitz. I like Rabbi Schultz. And Rabbi Schultz sees it this way. And this is how they would kind of go through the morning, talking about the Torah. Well, you can imagine there were growing factions as well. And hence you get the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Essenes. Well, Jesus didn't do that. Jesus would get up, he would read the verse, he would explain it, and he would say, that's it. It's according to me. See, he taught with authority. But the religious leaders, they were threatened by this. So they planted a trap for him. That withered guy, the guy with the withered hand, they put him there. Sitting in the front row, just like this guy right here. Sitting in the front row. And they knew Jesus was going to come into the synagogue and see this guy. And they knew what he would do. This is kind of like the big gotcha moment. See, Matthew tells the same story, but he adds a line there. He says, they questioned Jesus, asking, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. They were setting him up. Now let me ask you a question. Here's a guy with a withered hand. And here's Jesus with the power to heal his hand. And they ask the question, can you do this on the Sabbath? Look, how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where a man's hand cannot be healed because it's the Sabbath? And that's kind of the question that Jesus put to him. How did we get to this point? Well, there is an answer for that. See, historically, during that 400 period between the Old and the New Testament, there was no king in Israel, okay? You remember they came back from the exile? And they had the priests, they had the people, they had the wall, they had the temple, they had all that. But the Persians would not let them have a king. So, as you know, nature abhors a vacuum. There's an authority figure now that's not there. So who came in to fill the vacuum? Well, the priestly class did. They came in and they started taking control. Do you ever heard of the statement, he who owns the gold makes the rules? And these guys started making rules. Well, and then you began to get these divisions, these groups were forming. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they all came out of this time period in this situation. To the point that when Jesus arrived on the scene, you had these very controlling religious leaders who were dominating the people and telling them, this is what the law means. This is how you do this. You can do this, but you can't do that. Religion. That's all it was. Religion. So their real motive here, the real motive in this little situation with Jesus and the guy with the withered hand is they want to use this as a means of catching them. It was a public place. And if they could get Jesus to trip up on the law, well, we'd all know now, this guy's not who he thinks he is. Mark 3:3. So he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he said to them, to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill it?" What was their response? Silence. They had no answer. You see, their gotcha moment became Jesus' gotcha moment. You know, it's kind of like at this point in a movie where the bad guy goes down, you kind of have this sense of, yay, you know. What a pathetic question. Can I heal this guy on the Sabbath or not? Their silence spoke loudly. Can you imagine being in that room at the time when Jesus was confronting those Pharisees? You're just kind of one of the guys in the crowd, and you're watching this go on, and you realize, you know what? This carpenter from Galilee has just put these guys in their place. Wow. Well, you can imagine what the end of the story. These guys didn't roll over and play dead. Jesus said to the guy, "Stretch out your hand," and he healed them. But you know, this really isn't Jesus versus the Pharisees or Jesus versus the religious guys. It really is Satan versus God. Okay? And we know that eventually these same guys are the ones that were able to convince the Roman government to take Jesus to the cross and kill him. They were the ones that initiated that whole thing. And that's why it says in Mark 3:6, the Pharisees went out after this little event and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. This is the seeds of Jesus going to the cross. Now keep in mind, Pharisees, Herodians, it's kind of like the Bloods and the Crips, okay? There is no way on any given day that you could get these two guys together in the same room and even agree on what time it was. But now that Jesus is threatening their little kingdom, they've joined forces. Do you see how threatened they are? Do you see how desperate they've become? Do you see how much power means to these guys? I think there's three things we want to learn this morning from this little passage. First of all, our hearts are very dark. Now, it'd be a mistake this morning to look at the Pharisees and say, well, those guys. No, this is really about us as well. It's not just those guys. It's all of our hearts. It's an insight into how dark our hearts can be, how much we can avoid the truth, how blind we can become, how deceiving we can be with ourselves about who Jesus is and what the truth is. This isn't just the Pharisees. This is us as well. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is more deceitful than all else. It is desperately sick. Who can understand it? Now, who can understand it? How did they get that way? Could be any of us. How many of you have been reading stories in the news recently about people who have been big leaders in the Christian church, very well-known people who have suddenly walked away from the faith and now are involved in what they call deconstructing their faith? They're explaining it away. You can convince yourself of anything if you want to. Number two, I think it's very clear that God hates religion. Religion is man's version of God, and it's never right. You know, Jesus came into a fallen world. I mean, he looked around and I'm sure he said, there's a lot going on here that ain't right. And he could have picked a lot of different things to start trying to fix, right? He could have tried to get, better curbs on Main Street. He could have ran down, tried to help the homeless shelter, could have gone over here, got involved in politics, could have run for mayor. I'm sure he could have done all these things. He could have really put himself into fixing things. But he didn't. He really only had one real thing that he hated. And that was the religious people. He did not like them. He was angry at them. It says, woe to you. This is what Jesus said to him. Woe to you. But if Jesus is saying woe to you, it's like, whoa. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter. Nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Jesus didn't like these guys. God doesn't like religion. Three things. Your heart, God hates religion. And number three, you can't overlook the fact that God used evil people to accomplish His purposes. You cannot overlook the fact that God used evil people to accomplish His purposes. You know that when Jesus went to the cross and hung on that cross, there were a lot of guys in Israel standing around wringing their hands thinking, we got him. We got him. But in fact, it wasn't their victory. It was our victory. It was God's victory. And God used all of their evil to accomplish His purposes. Even our greatest enemies can be used to accomplish God's purposes in our lives. Let's pray. Wow, what a lesson, Lord. You really are in control. And you are really able to deliver us from evil. And we thank you this morning for all that you do and all that you will do. In Jesus' name.